Welcome to the webinar today. It's a small one, so we will hopefully be able to have a lot of chats together. Today we're talking about online events, specifically tips and tricks for making sure your next online event runs as smoothly as possible. If you don't know me, my name is Megan Guidry and I'm training lead for New Zealand eScience infrastructure. And in my role at NeSI, I've coordinated and facilitated many webinars, online workshops, birds of a feather sessions, and other bits. So the tips that I share with you come mainly from my experiences. But as I was saying before, you also have many experiences being a part of online events. It's kind of our thing the past couple of years. So I'm very interested in hearing your perspective, your tips as well. I'll ask throughout the webinar if you want to share your own tips or ask questions. It's going to be pretty casual, and the more you participate, I think the better it will be for everyone. So please feel free to share as much as you like. So an overview of what we're going to be discussing today. How is the topic broken down? There are 4 subtopics I'll be going through during the webinar, and they are how to effectively host a session online, how you can start your session strong and get your audience engaged early, what to consider when deciding the level of interaction you'll be facilitating in your session, and finally, what types of helpers you should loop in for your event, and what exactly do they do. Now, regarding how we're interacting today, you may or may not be familiar with Zoom, so I'll briefly show you how to signal you have something to share before we proceed. One option is to raise your hand in Zoom, which you do by clicking the reactions tab and then raise hand. I'll invite you all to give that a go really quick in case, just test it in case you haven't done it for a while. Remind ourselves how to give that a go. Thank you. Awesome. Looks like everyone has found it. We got a hand clap too. Thanks, Iron. I appreciate that one. And just a point, a note, if you raise your hand doesn't go down on its own. So if you get your question answered, please lower your hand so that we know whether a hand is new or old. So I'll ask you to lower those hands too. Make sure we all got that under control. You guys can also chat with each other and post questions and comments in the Zoom chat. I've asked my colleague Jana, hey Jana, to monitor the chat for me to make sure that nothing gets lost. I did share before the link to the shared document as well, so you can post things in the chat or in the shared document that looks like this. Questions, comments, suggestions, links, they can all be posted in this shared document. Chaos is great. I'll go through and organize it later on, so don't feel like you are messing up anything by adding to the document. The more information there, the better for us all. And finally, before we begin, a little bit of normal housekeeping, standard Zoom etiquette. Just some reminders. If you're not speaking, please make sure your audio is on mute so we reduce background noise. I'll also urge you to keep your video on throughout the session to make the webinar feel more comfortable and friendly. And finally, I remind you that the session is being recorded. So if you want to revisit any of the ideas or topics we discussed today, you will be able to do so in the next few days once the recording's posted. Okay, so enough blabbering. Let's talk about our online sessions, starting with hosting sessions online. What do we mean by hosting? What does an online session that is hosted well look like? Let's chat about it. Now, I imagine that the host of your online session is kind of like a bookshelf with 2 bookends. They provide structure to the start and end of your online session, but they are also an active supporter throughout the middle portion of your webinar. So in the beginning, they welcome people, go through housekeeping, introduce speakers, tell people how they are going to get help throughout the webinar or how they're going to ask questions during the session. Essentially, what I have just done in the first few minutes of this webinar is what your host will typically do. And doing this means your attendees feel settled and comfortable and that they're primed for any sort of activity that will be happening later on in the online session. The host might then fade into the background a bit if you have other speakers or kind of a main event, and do things like take attendance, take notes, make sure attendees get their questions answered. Maybe they'll monitor time. And then right before everyone signs off the call, the host of the session might jump back into the spotlight, wrap up the session with thank yous, some follow-up information, maybe a survey link. If you're recording your session, having a clear-cut ending and having your host come back on the screen makes for a cleaner video and makes kind of post-processing, some editing a bit easier. So that's just a little tip for you. Even if the host doesn't do too much at the end to wrap up, just having them come on screen makes you kind of adds a nice kind of finished look to your event online. Yeah, so I tend to try to have a clear-cut ending whenever I do something online, if it's recorded. So some go-to tips for hosting a session online, and reminder as I go through these, please type in the shared document. If you have any other suggestions, we can add to the list. You can pop those just in this little list here. Anything goes there. Biggest tip, write a script for your housekeeping slides or any slides for that matter, because if you put your script or notes right in front of your camera on your computer, you can read through them or just have them really easily accessible and it looks like you're making eye contact with your audience. That's one of the best things about doing things online, in my opinion, is that you can have your notes just right in front of you. Though it's helpful if you write your notes or your scripts in a conversational way. Second tip, introduce everyone that will be speaking or presenting early on in your session. It can be a bit awkward if you dive straight into content without telling people who they're listening to and what the background is of the people presenting. And it's a little hard to backtrack, or it just feels like you kind of have a shift in momentum if you have to go back and reintroduce people. So doing that at the start is a good idea. And finally, don't skip the basic housekeeping reminders. It's much easier to present to real human faces than a bunch of black boxes online. So remind people to keep their video on if possible. Remind people how to find things like chat to raise their hand, because we don't want to assume everyone knows how to use things like Zoom or Teams. Everyone is using a different tool, and doing those reminders makes your session more accessible. I'll also say that you don't have to have a host for every online session you run, but if you do, your speakers can devote all of their mental energy to presenting well, answering questions, instead of getting distracted by the logistics and the actual flow of the session itself. So if you can find a host for your session, it is a nice touch. So what else would you guys like to add about this topic, hosting? Does anyone want to share their own tips for hosting online sessions? Roland, I see a hand. Go for it.
Yeah, I was just sort of asking if anyone does, for workshops, whether anyone does the sort of thing that says, okay, this is what you're here to learn, and, you know, depending if it's a training workshop or not, because I guess for the training workshop, it's like, this is what you're going to learn. It's that sort of introduction about what they're expecting. Do many people do that? That was my first question. The second question was, in a buff, do many people focus on the amount of discussion that gets done versus like having aims for the buff to say, well, what's going to be successful? Is it because a lot of people are participating, and has anyone done that? And I'm just kind of curious if that's worked out well or not.
I'll pause and see if anyone wants to jump in to encourage some initial communication, sharing. Yeah, Yvette.
Morning, everybody, and apologies, I missed the beginning of the meeting. I would say I tend to always give an overview of a session, whether it's a workshop or a BOF, So give people a feeling for what's going to happen if you're going to have, so it's not necessarily learning outcomes if it's a BOF, but it might be what we're going to do in the session, what we're hoping to get out of it. Normally, a successful BOF for me is if everyone feels like they've connected and got something out of it. And often we've found a couple of presentations and then facilitated questions after that works really well. I don't know if other people have comments on that.
Yeah.
Do.
Go ahead, Laura.
Hello. I also was in the same meeting that made Yvette late. I do quite a lot of online teaching. And if you're doing a workshop, I think it's quite useful. And I've had this experience, and I share this anecdote to make it funny, is I say, you know, this is the workshop we're in. This is what we're going to cover. So if any of you are in the wrong room, leave now. I have had one person get up and go, sorry, I think I am, bless him, and off he trotted. But it was funny, and that's fine.
Totally. Yeah, I think I'll touch on this in a bit, but I do tend to like to share an agenda. Just so people, yeah, like Laura said, some people might have found themselves in the wrong room, or they might be anticipating going to a lecture. And if you tell them, hey, we're going to be doing breakout room discussions, they're like, I am not in the mood for that today. I think I need to pass on this. Just preparing people for what they're going to be doing. It's usually a good idea.
I really like that too, Megan. I've been guilty of that, tuning into something because I poorly maybe want to multitask, or I've got other things that I wanted to listen to the background, and they said right up front, okay, we're going to get into breakout room discussions and do this, and I didn't have the capacity to do that, so I logged off, and we'll get the recording later. But I think that's good for just managing expectations of what's going to happen, which is always good.
Yeah, totally. I'm just going to have a peek at the shared document and see what's being entered in here. Oh, cool. So it's HackMD, some tools are being posted. Kick off with an overview of a BOF, could be learning outcomes for a workshop. Agree, that's a good tip. Successful BOF people have connected. Awesome, yes. Agree. All right, I'll continue on. Murray stating in the chat, also stating when breaks will be. Yes, I'd like to do that because people kind of, especially if it's a full day thing, a half day thing, might usually want to know when they can sneak away, do an email, when they can have their tea, when bio breaks will be. It's just considerate to everyone to tell people when breaks are and stick to them, stick to the breaks. Okay, let's continue on to our next topic. Which is starting your session off strong. So let's assume you have your session host for your online event. They have done the housekeeping and intros. What comes next? How do we engage with our attendees? We want to be mindful of the way we spend the first 5 minutes of an online session, because if we're not careful, we might find ourselves facilitating a session that feels a bit flat. So your audience will very quickly slip into a passive kind of observer mode if you don't engage with them early on and invite them to participate, which is not in itself a bad thing if you're doing something like a seminar or a lecture where you want people to listen. But if you want interaction, asking for it right away and facilitating it right away is going to be key. So if you want engagement, want people to ask questions or propose topics for discussion, demonstrate early on exactly how you want your audience to take part in the online session. If you don't tell people how to engage, you're more likely to have a Zoom room that looks kind of like this, which is tough to present to say the least. So some suggestions to get your online session off to a good start. And once again, I'll pose the question to the audience soon, but some tips from me. During the session introduction, it's helpful to be as clear as possible about how the session is designed and what the expectations are around participation. that's kind of what we just said before. People that are expecting to sit in on a lecture may not respond well when you throw them into a small group discussion without any warning. So do things like sharing the agenda, telling people when the breaks will be, and let them know when there will likely be action or participation required from them. By doing this, anyone who finds themselves in the wrong place can quietly exit, and your audience is a bit more at ease about what's to come. Second tip is to get people to try using the tools that they will be asked to use later on in the session as a little warm-up exercise. So maybe it's the Zoom chat, maybe it's the raise hand feature or a Google Doc. There are many tools you can use in an online session, and we'll discuss some of your tool options in just a bit. But getting people to actively use these tools, maybe in an icebreaker, means there will be less reluctance from your attendees to get involved later on. So I did this today when I asked you to test out the raise hand feature, just to kind of get you to know, like, hey, I do want you to pose your suggestions. This is how I think that would be a good way for us to do it. You know, lowering the barrier for participation early on. And finally, if your session will involve a lot of audience participation and you want people to get to know each other, you can consider including an icebreaker in your session. Letting people introduce themselves one by one is a nice touch, but it can be time consuming. So if you have a big group, you can do an icebreaker in a shared document like an Etherpad or a Google Doc, which means that people can answer questions simultaneously on the screen. On the screen, you can see a screenshot of an icebreaker question we used at a recent machine learning workshop and kind of the different responses you get, but you can pre-populate your Etherpad or Google Doc with any sort of questions ahead of time as a nice way to get people to get involved, but they don't all have to talk at the same time, which can be time consuming and difficult. So what else should we consider if we're wanting to start off our session well? Does anyone have any tips or examples that they'd like to share? Yeah, go for it, George.
Just it's calling out the obvious, but one of the things that has been really useful for us is these shared docs. So just like Megan's got prepared here already, and having that balance between a host and a support person, or the presenter and the Zoom DJ, or having a pairing, and then someone dropping that link in somewhat regularly for the latecomers, that sort of thing. So I think that's something that's really useful.
Thanks, George. Yeah, and one thing I also like about having that shared document is you obviously kind of lose things in chat more easily, or it's hard to remember all the questions that were asked and the answers that go to them unless they're recorded in a shared document. So it's a nice tool to go back and look at what was covered. And if you do things like make summaries or blog posts about online events like that, so other people can appreciate what was covered, it's a really nice resource to be able to go back to. Any other? Yes, Johansson.
Hi, good morning to everyone. Aside from the initial sharing, there's also in previous online sessions that I was able to attend, there was a part wherein the audience or the participants were allowed by the host. There's a particular activity wherein people will annotate. It's kind of exciting to do something live together with your co-participants. Then you annotate things, whether you put symbols such as where you came from, or any comments. So it's kind of nice to have it live. It's like you have an online Blackboard. So it's getting young and kid again. Those type of stuff.
Totally. Yeah. And people like to interact in different ways too. And so if you give them some variety in how they can participate, it's usually a good idea. Yeah. Thanks for that.
I like to, Megan, what you've done in past sessions is sometimes that intro question or icebreaker can be really simple. You know, what do you see in front of you right now? What are you wearing? You know, or like, what's your, what'd you have for lunch today? Just like something really easy to get people going. And sometimes there can be some, you know, some light answers that will get a chuckle, or, you know, both people will be looking out on a great view, or, you know, what's out there, what's, you know, surrounding them, or, you know, a common pastime or something like that. And I think keeping that initial conversation just really easy, it is just to get the conversation going a little bit. Is a good tip. It doesn't have to be a big loaded question to get things going.
Oh yeah, totally. And keeping it simple is usually the way to go. Just get some people talking, kind of mirror how you want the rest of the session to go early on, and you're set. Cool, thanks guys. Having a quick look over here in case there's anything else that we should draw our attention to. Don't think so, but Jenna, wave frantically if I'm missing something. All right, let's continue on. We're now going to discuss some of those tools that you could use to facilitate online interaction. And how do you decide which tool to use? Because there are lots and lots of options, some that you can pay for, some that you can try for free. And I'd love to get your ideas on this. So very excited to crowdsource for this one. But first, so every online session will have a different goal or anticipated outcome. Many of you are probably here today because you're planning on running a Birds of a Feather session for eResearch New Zealand next month. So you might have a bit of an idea of what you want to achieve with your BOF, or maybe you're running a workshop or a meeting online. The way your audience interacts with you, with your other speakers, and with each other should help you achieve that session goal. So if you want to collect ideas or information from your audience, you might want to consider using something like Slido, which has polls and different sort of ways to interact, word cloud options. Zoom polls are good if you're a Zoom person. They're built in and they're quite easy to set up. Or maybe even a whiteboard tool. Zoom also has a whiteboard feature, and shared document with pre-populated prompts. Those are some suggestions I have off the top of my head. If you want your audience to make connections with each other, breakout rooms are a good option. They sometimes can involve a lot of pre-planning. So just something to be aware of. They are good to practice ahead of time if you're not used to using breakout rooms, and having a Zoom DJ or a Zoom breakout room helper on the call to help you facilitate those is usually a good idea. But there's also these tools coming out like Spatial Chat or GatherTown that can be fun and engaging. They encourage people to network, and they have more of that you can wander around vibe and have different sort of people conversing, but in the same sort of online virtual room space. I believe Spatial Chat and GatherTown both have free versions for small events. So if you're interested, please have a look at that. I think I included links to them in the shared document at the top. And if you want your audience to learn something from the speakers, you probably want to focus on your question and answer mechanism, and you maybe not want to do anything too fancy with getting the audience to chat with each other. Perhaps it's the raise hand feature in Zoom, something simple like that, or you have a helper monitoring questions in chat, or some other sort of shared document. So in a second, I'll get you guys to share some other tools that you would recommend, and I'll have a look at the chat too in case any have been popped in there. But first, so my two top tips for this are, for your own sake as an event host or a facilitator, keep the number of tools to a minimum. Pick one or two, do them well, and if they are less complicated, it's probably better. And if you do want to use breakout rooms for your session, I encourage you to have a designated breakout room helper. I kind of mentioned this before. That's there specifically to handle sending people out and bringing people back from your breakout rooms. And you might also want to have room facilitators in each of your breakout rooms to keep conversation flowing. and to answer questions. So what other tips and tools come to mind for you guys? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise a hand. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, Murray.
I wrote it down in the doc as well, but being, especially when you've got lots of things going on, being really explicit about where you expect people to be engaging at a particular time is really useful. So like if you've got a shared activity, like everybody let's go over to the shared doc or put your messages in chat so then people know where to look.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder of why I tend to like Etherpad more than a shared Google Doc if I'm going to be using the shared doc a lot, because Etherpad has those line numbers and I can say, hey, go to line 100 in the Etherpad. Whereas if you get a Google Doc, if it gets too long, no one can keep track of where things are happening in the document. So that's a nice tip. Thanks, Mary. Cool. Will also shared in the chat that you can sign up for a free personal account on Mural, which has like sticky notes, different, kind of like a whiteboard feature, but they have lots of good functionality there. Thanks for that, Will. George, I saw your hand.
Yeah, so one thing I found going into those breakout sessions that Murray just referred to, and you know, be really explicit about where you want people to spend their attention. That's both in, I've found sometimes they'll give you the question, they'll say, you know, focus on this question, and you'll go to the breakout room and there'll be nowhere that you can see the question, you know, so it's as simple as making sure that's written down in something like the shared doc that people can still see. It's not just in your presentation slides. So because they'll forget it, they'll forget the keyword. Did they want us to think about the past or the future, or, you know, a subtle difference? So making sure while you're in your breakout space, they can still see what that question or that topic is somewhere else.
Very good point. Yeah, it's almost like when you go to that breakout room, you're transported to a whole new world. And it's like and people tend to half listen to a question, it's human nature. And then you're like, wait a minute, what are we doing? Yeah. Good point, George. Laura.
Hello, thank you. I think I'm going to answer Yvette's question that she's just posed to me. In ResBaz late last year, we used a tool called Padlet. I got this because my kids at primary school use it, and I found it for them to be really engaging because you can share text, you can upvote it, you can comment on somebody else's post, but you can also share links or photos, or it's much more colorful. A lot of the tools that we use are quite monochromatic and a bit techie looking and feeling, whereas Padlet is really colorful, or can be.
I want to go investigate Padlet immediately because I like color. I like the sound of this. Awesome. And sharing pictures and things too. Yeah, that's one thing with Etherpad. It's usually quite simple, which is good and useful. But yeah, if you want a little bit more pizzazz, cool.
I've posted an example of an open Padlet that we used.
Ooh. Let me see. I'm just having a look now. Oh, cool.
So if you scroll over to the, yep, go over there, more, and then down.
Ooh.
In that colored bit, we've posted pictures or websites, or one of our people in this talk actually wrote a poem and recited it for the session. That was cool.
Wow. Yeah, nice. And then you can kind of just add rows as you go along through your session or something. Ooh, very cool.
That works particularly well for communities that don't otherwise feel very included.
Mm. Thanks for that, Laura. Amazing. I am having a look now at the Google Doc and just having a quick skim to see what other tools have been mentioned. So Excalidraw, actually, we taught about this in Carpentries, or it came up in Carpentries. Can anyone tell me a bit more about Excalidraw? What's that one good for? I'm not sure, Laura, that's an old hand that you have up, I think. No takers on Excalidraw. We'll have to do our own research.
Was that one a diagram?
I think it might be like, yeah, like flow chart or something.
I feel like that we use it in the instructor training for people to do their diagrams.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So diagramming, flowchart, Excalidraw. So Mentimeter, I think that's another like polling, Figma, Stormboard. Awesome. Lots of things to, I'm gonna go through, add links to these later on. And so this resources links fest at the top should get longer if you check back in a day or two. So maybe bookmark this Google Doc if you want to come back and look at some of these resources later. Cool. All right, let's continue on. If you have anything else you want to share, please interrupt, shout it out, but we'll continue to our last topic, which is helpers. So what type of helpers should you have at your session? Let's consider some options. And of course, it's up to you to decide what kind of helpers you will need at your online event. Depending on what it is, you'll need different sorts of support. In this list, so on the screen, I've included the types of help that I have found most beneficial for different types of online events. First on the list is the Zoom DJ, which we have talked about a little bit already. But the Zoom DJ handles sending people to and from breakout rooms, keeps track of breakout room timing, and is kind of generally there to handle all of that while the host and speakers focus on other hosting and speaking duties. So it's really beneficial to have that person because it can get complicated, especially if you have more than, a dozen people in a Zoom room, getting people to the right breakout rooms and everything. Having a Zoom DJ, good idea. There's also hosts and co-hosts who answer technical questions and ensure the session is running smoothly. The hosts and co-hosts usually will be making sure the helpers have what they need. So if you do have a helper back channel where helpers and instructors are chatting about like, oh, I'm going to go to breakout room to help this person, or hey, this person seems to be stuck on this thing, the host and co-host will keep an eye on that back channel and make sure everyone has what they need. So it could be a good idea to have multiple people in that role just to make sure things are running smoothly, depending on how big of a session you're running. Having more than one person in that sort of role is nice just because they can bounce ideas off of each other. And if anyone gets stuck, there is someone as a backup for help. Leaning on each other is always a good idea. Next, if you're doing a workshop or hands-on session, say a carpentries workshop, you'll need people to actually help your learners troubleshoot. Helping people online is tricky in the best of times. So practicing how this will work ahead of time is very much time well spent. So if you're wondering how many helpers you need for a particular workshop size, 1 helper for every 5 learners is a pretty good rule of thumb. But I will say that at NeSI, at least, we tend to avoid having more than 25 to 30 learners in an online workshop. 30 would probably be a pretty big one too. That's because just once you get to 30 or more people in an online workshop in one room, you can't see everyone's faces on one screen. It's a little bit harder to scale and a little bit easier to kind of for some things to fall through the cracks. So that's just my 2 cents, but people would have different opinions on those numbers. Nominating someone to take notes is also extremely helpful, especially if you want to write a summary or recap of your event for a blog post or article. Finally, as we stated before, nominating someone to be the leader in your breakout room discussions can mean your attendees have a smoother conversation and better experience. So arranging breakout room facilitators is often worth the prep work. Cool. I'll ask in a second if anyone has other helper ideas to add to the list. But first, while we're on the topic of helpers, if you are here because you're running a Birds of a Feather session at eResearch New Zealand next month, please know that we're happy to provide your helpers with a direct link to the Zoom room for your session. They do not have to register for the conference if they're a helper to help at your session, but we do need to know the names and emails of these people by the end of next week. So if you can direct message me, let me know by the end of next week. we will make sure that those people, and Amelia's on the call. Hi, Amelia. You can message her as well. Make sure you give those helper names and email addresses so that we can send them the Zoom link for your session. Cool. All right. So question back to you guys. Any other ideas of sorts of help that either you've had at online events or that you've seen work well? Would love to hear from you guys. And I'll stop sharing now. I think this is the final topic. George, go for it.
This is really reflecting back a lot. All of my things are reflecting back a lot of things that I've seen you and the team apply. But make sure you prep your helpers. So it might be a short meeting prior, especially if you haven't done much of this before, where you agree who's doing what and how and what that means. And the other one is having that back channel for you and your helpers to go, holy moly, this has got out of hand, someone help, or whatever it needs to be. That we've found that quite helpful. So you know it's separate to this chat. It might not, it's invisible. you can you know, talk about something that's gone wrong that you need to fix and you need help with, that sort of thing.
Good call out, because it can be tempting to just say, I've got helpers, but they might not know what do you need in the event. So if you can prep them beforehand, really good use of time. Jenna, I saw your hand next.
Yeah, even just, I wanted to echo that advice to prep your helpers and also yourself. And or if you're having a co-host, just scheduling a dry run of your session so that you can work out timing. If you do have a co-host, making sure they have a copy of the slides as well. Just anything online will have technical issues. And I recall at a previous event, one of our NeSI colleagues got booted out, internet issues, and wasn't able to reconnect back in. But luckily, her co-host, knew what they wanted to get through the session, had a copy of the slides, picked it up and kept it going. So if you don't have that backup, I guess just in your own mind, having a bit of a plan about what happens if I get dropped off, right? Or if I run into some technical issues, and just the more that you can prepare or be ready for that, the what if situations, then when it happens, it won't be as stressful and won't be as much of a wrench in the machine. So just being aware of that. And sometimes attendees can fall into that trap too. If they get booted out, unfortunately, it can be stressful for them. So letting them know that either it's being recorded or that, you'll send out links to materials afterwards, things like that. Just knowing that you've got those backup mechanisms for either yourself, your co-hosts, or your attendees is helpful, because you can never trust that an online session will go completely smoothly. Although this one has gone really well. Well done, Megan.
Don't jinx it, Jenna. We still have a couple minutes left. Just kidding. Yvette.
I was probably going to say something along a similar line. Don't stress if things don't go quite to the way you thought it was going to go. Often it might go off in a completely different direction, or maybe you thought you might use Zoom rooms, but the group don't look like they're going to, so you can sort of just pivot slightly and do it in a different way, and just acknowledge if something happens, if people get booted off and they have to come back on. People are generally pretty forgiving, so if I was giving advice to people who hadn't done much of it before, don't stress about the little things. It all comes together in the end, and people usually have a good time, and it's productive no matter where it ends up.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And agree with being a little bit flexible. And it's one thing that has happened to me relatively often is you plan for having a certain number of people and maybe doing breakout rooms, but if you don't get that number and it's like you maybe a room full of 10 people, it's like, well, we're not going to do breakout rooms, so we're going to probably just try to all chat with each other. So having a backup plan for maybe different size groups or something makes it easier on you, and kind of takes the pressure off a little bit. I see some good things happening in chat, so let me just check that out. Ah, yes. So Murray, usual one, having a collaborative doc backup. Yeah, Etherpad, which I quite like, love it, but it does crash semi often. So having a Google Doc or something, or expecting that and being patient and having a backup plan is nice. Mary.
That's why it came into my head. Another way of managing people's attention with collaborative documents is to have like a document that nobody else sees and you copy and paste through the prompts as you go through, rather than having like everything in the document and people whizzing ahead.
Yeah, that's true, because it's very tempting to just go ahead if you see it all laid out. Awesome. All right, we're 2 minutes until the end of the session, but I did want to ask, did we forget anything? What else would you like to share about hosting sessions online, running online sessions before we sign off today? Really good discussion and ideas, and I'll be sending you guys a little summary of all the resources in the next day or so. So know that you'll get that in your inbox if you've registered for the webinar. Any final comments?
I guess that's one thing, is that it's harder perhaps for e-research because you don't know who's going to be attending your session in advance. They register for the conference, but not necessarily for your session. But that is a good tip, is to have a registration or some sort of sign up form, or maybe those who do attend in that collaborative doc, if they do want to leave an email address, although maybe they don't want to share that, but because that gives you a mechanism to follow up with people afterwards, or even before the session. For example, if the plan changes or you want them to look at something beforehand, it's nice to be able to connect with people after the fact. And I think sometimes too, people will join BOFs or workshops to, again, depending on the purpose of it, to connect with people, and they're often looking to maybe, get those names and meet different people. So having an ability for them to connect after the session is good, because then maybe they can go off and do their collaborations outside of it too.
100%, Jenna, and 100% Yvette too. Yes, keep it simple. A lot of times you have lots of things you want to get through in your BOF and you might not have time for it. If that happens, you're human. Congratulations. That's normal. Yvette, you want to add anything?
I would say it usually means you've had pretty good discussion, because it means people have taken off with something you've talked about, or they want to ask lots of questions following a presentation. So yeah, but don't expect to always get through everything. That's okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. It's a positive thing. All right, guys, thanks for the conversation and the ideas. It's been a really good webinar today. As I said, I'll send you through a follow-up email in the next day or so, but have a great afternoon, everyone, and hopefully I'll see you soon.